September 12th, 1683. Cannon smoke shrouded the walls of Vienna. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and fear. Imagine it. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers in glittering armor stretching to the horizon, their war drums pounding like a single heartbeat echoing across the Danube. Inside the city, just 11,000 exhausted defenders stood their ground, bakers, priests, soldiers, even children clutching makeshift weapons, all staring down an army nearly 15 times their size. Europe itself, trembling at the edge of collapse. For months, the city had been under siege. Bread had become dust, rats were currency, and yet new research from the Austrian war archives, unearthed diaries, Ottoman field maps, and forgotten military letters reveal how close Vienna came to falling before dawn. Historian Andrew Wheatcroft once said, "Vienna was not just a city, it was the hinge of Europe. If it broke, the door to the west would swing open forever." Picture the Ottoman encampment, 150,000 men, endless tents forming a white ocean beyond the city's battered ramparts. Their Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, orchestrated the siege with ruthless precision, his engineers tunneling beneath the walls, his cannons reducing bastions to rubble. But here's where it gets interesting. Newly analyzed Ottoman maps show secret mining routes that nearly reached Vienna's central square before being discovered. Just hours before detonation, one more night, and the city would have been erased. Why then did a Polish king hundreds of miles away decide to risk everything for a foreign city? Why march across mountains to defend a cause not his own? King John III Sobieski, a man whose very name would become legend, saw Vienna as more than a city. He saw it as civilization's final bastion, and what followed was one of history's most improbable rescues. Imagine the roar of hoofbeats echoing from Kahlenberg Hill as dawn broke. 3,000 Winged Hussars, their wings glinting in the morning light, descending upon the Ottoman lines like a storm of angels. But this isn't where the story ends. Far from it. Hidden within Vienna's archives are coded messages exchanged between the defenders and the Polish army, revealing a secret coordination plan long thought impossible under siege conditions. What they found was unprecedented, a story buried beneath centuries of myth and dust. And as scholars from Krakow to Istanbul piece together the fragments, one truth becomes clear. Europe's fate hinged not just on strength, but on timing, faith, and a single desperate gamble. But before we understand how Vienna was saved, we must see how it nearly fell. It began, as most great collapses do, with a sense of disbelief. By the summer of 1683, the Ottoman Empire, once a distant storm on Europe's horizon, had become an all-consuming tempest. For centuries, its armies had rolled across the Balkans, devouring kingdoms, fortresses, and faiths in their path. The crescent standard now loomed before the gates of Vienna, the very heart of the Holy Roman Empire. In those tense weeks of July, as the cicadas droned and the Danube shimmered beneath a pitiless sun, few could imagine that the city's endurance would decide the fate of a continent. At the heart of this drama stood three men whose ambitions and fears would define the age. Emperor Leopold I, a cautious ruler whose empire was fracturing under pressure. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman commander whose confidence bordered on divine certainty. And King John III Sobieski of Poland, a soldier-philosopher whose sense of destiny would carry him across mountains to meet history head-on. Between them lay Vienna, a city half-starved, half-ruined but unbroken. When the Ottoman army first appeared on the plains outside Vienna in mid-July, it was less an army than a moving world. Eyewitness accounts describe a serpent of men and beasts stretching for miles, 150,000 soldiers, 60,000 camels, and an endless train of artillery and supplies. Their tents shimmered like silk seas, their banners glowed crimson in the dawn. The city's defenders, led by Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, peered from the walls in disbelief. His letters, preserved today in the Austrian state archives, record the moment in stark simplicity. The earth trembles with their approach. God alone can help us. Within days, the siege began. The Ottomans encircled Vienna in a tightening noose, cutting off all supply routes. Artillery roared day and night, turning the once proud ramparts into ragged skeletons of stone. The defenders, numbering barely 11,000 soldiers and a few thousand civilians, faced not just the enemy, but famine, disease, and despair. Starhemberg's men subsisted on blackened bread made from sawdust and horsemeat. The city's wells ran foul. Plague crept through the narrow alleys like an invisible thief. And yet, the human spirit, that stubborn defiance of odds, refused to break. Church bells became coded signals used to coordinate defenses across the crumbling walls. Monks carried powder kegs instead of rosaries. Women joined the fire brigades, dousing flames and carrying water to the wounded. One chronicle speaks of the Vienna bell ringers, a band of civilians who used the city's bells not for prayer, but for battle, their rhythmic peals signaling Ottoman tunneling activity beneath the earth. It was trench warfare centuries before the term existed. Kara Mustafa Pasha, observing from his opulent command tent, saw the siege as his destiny. He had promised Sultan Mehmed IV that he would deliver Vienna intact, a jewel of Christendom turned into a mosque. His engineers, trained in the art of subterranean warfare, began digging mines beneath the city walls, packing them with barrels of black powder. But the Viennese were equally ingenious. Using primitive stethoscopes made from wooden rods, they listened through the earth for the telltale scrape of Ottoman shovels. Counterminers were sent below, fighting in the dark with torches and daggers. The underground war was silent, claustrophobic, and deadly. When one of the Ottoman mines finally exploded beneath the Berg bastion, the shockwave sent stones and bodies into the air. Yet even then the defenders held. Meanwhile, far from Vienna's burning skyline, diplomacy and desperation converged. Emperor Leopold had fled westward, leaving the city to its fate, but envoys raced through Europe, begging for aid. Most rulers hesitated. Alliances were fragile, and the Ottomans were feared as unstoppable. But one monarch answered, John III Sobieski of Poland. His decision stunned Europe. In his diary, he wrote simply, I go to save not Vienna, but Christendom itself. Gathering an army of some 30,000 men, he forged a coalition with German and Austrian forces, a union few had believed possible. It was, as the historian Richard Holmes later wrote, an alliance born not of trust, but of shared terror. By early September, the relief army began its grueling march toward Vienna. The journey across the Alps was a logistical nightmare. Wagons overturned on narrow passes, soldiers slept in freezing rain, and horses perished by the hundreds. Yet the Poles pressed on, driven by faith and the magnetic will of their king. Sobieski's cavalry, the famed Winged Hussars, trained for speed and shock. Their armor gleamed like molten silver, and the wooden wings fixed to their backs whistled through the air when they charged. Modern aerodynamic tests by military historians at Krakow University reveal that the wings did more than inspire terror. They broke the airflow behind riders, stabilizing them at full gallop. Science confirming legend. As the coalition army neared Vienna, Kara Mustafa's spies reported their approach. The Grand Vizier believed he could crush them before they arrived, ordering an intensified bombardment. Starhemberg, within the city, watched the skyline glow red from the constant explosions. In one surviving letter to his wife, he wrote, "If God wills it, I shall not live to see tomorrow's dawn." Supplies were gone. Ammunition was nearly spent. Yet as dawn approached on September 12th, smoke parted on the hills north of Vienna, revealing an army poised like a coiled spring. Sobieski had arrived. The final battle began at sunrise. The first cannon thundered from the Ottoman lines, echoing through the valleys. Dust and gunpowder rolled across the plain like fog. The Christian coalition formed in 4 sectors. On the left, the imperial troops. In the center, the Germans and Austrians. And on the right, Sobieski's Poles, hidden behind Kahlenberg Hill. It was a calculated trap. The Ottomans, confident after months of siege, believed their numbers would overwhelm the defenders before reinforcements could coordinate. They were wrong. By midday, the valley had become a cauldron. Thousands of muskets crackled, sabers flashed, and cannon fire tore through ranks of men. The smell of burning pitch and sweat was suffocating. Kara Mustafa's elite Janissaries advanced with disciplined precision, their green banners fluttering, their chants rising above the din. For hours the battle seesawed, neither side yielding. At one point, the Ottoman sappers breached a section of the city wall, pouring through in a desperate rush, only to be driven back by a handful of exhausted defenders fighting hand-to-hand among the rubble. Then came the turning point. From his vantage point atop Kallenberg Hill, Sobieski surveyed the battlefield. The Ottomans had overextended, their flanks exposed. The Polish king turned to his men and raised his sword. "Non nobis, Domine," he said softly. "Not unto us, O Lord." Trumpets blared. The hills erupted. 18,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry charge in recorded history, descended upon the Ottoman lines. Witnesses later described the ground shaking, the sky filled with dust and the gleam of steel. The hussars' wings screamed like banshees as they tore through the enemy ranks. It was less a battle than an avalanche. Within moments, the Ottoman front collapsed. Panic spread. The Janissaries, once feared across continents, broke formation. Kara Mustafa's grand army dissolved into chaos. From the city's ramparts, the defenders watched in disbelief as the tide turned before their eyes. Starhemberg ordered a sortie from within, meeting Sobieski's forces in the burning streets. By nightfall, the Ottoman banners had fallen, and Vienna stood free. Europe exhaled, but the aftermath was no triumphal feast. It was revelation. The scale of the siege left the land scarred, and the survivors hollow-eyed. Vienna's streets were littered with broken cannons and the bodies of men who had fought for both sides. Yet among the ruins lay objects that would rewrite history: meticulously drawn Ottoman maps, intricate siege tools, and richly embroidered tents abandoned by the fleeing vizier. Many of these artifacts survive today, preserved in museums in Krakow and Vienna. The tent of Kara Mustafa himself, an ornate structure of green silk and gold thread, stands in the Wawel Castle Museum, a haunting monument to imperial ambition and ruin. Kara Mustafa Pasha did not live to see another campaign. Upon his return to Belgrade, he was executed by order of the Sultan, strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method reserved for failed viziers. His empire's dream of conquering Europe died with him, though the echoes of that ambition would linger for centuries. Historians like John Stoy have called it the moment the Ottoman tide began to ebb, a slow retreat from the European heartland that would reshape geopolitics for generations. And yet, as modern scholars re-examine the evidence, new mysteries surface. Excavations near Vienna's outer walls in 2017 uncovered collapsed tunnels filled with Ottoman tools, suggesting sections of the mine network that historians never knew existed. Forensic analysis of bone fragments in the same layers revealed the remains of both Christian and Ottoman miners, men who died fighting face-to-face beneath the earth, never recorded in any chronicle. Science, archaeology, and history converging to illuminate the forgotten corners of a world-defining siege. What makes the Battle of Vienna so enduring is not merely the spectacle of its victory, but the fragility of the margin. One misstep, one delay, and the outcome could have been reversed. Imagine for a moment a Europe without Vienna, where the Danube Valley became an Ottoman stronghold, where the Renaissance flames sputtered under a different banner. The stakes were more than territorial. They were civilizational. Sobieski understood that. In a letter to his queen after the battle, he wrote, "We came, we saw, and God conquered." And yet, beneath the triumphal tone lies humility, the awareness that history turns not on destiny, but on decision. The alliance that saved Vienna was fragile, improvised, and born of desperation. But it worked, if only for a moment. That moment changed the world. As the smoke cleared and the church bells rang once more, Vienna awoke not to peace but to purpose. The city had endured the unendurable. Its walls bore scars that would never fade. And somewhere in the silence that followed, among the ashes and prayers, a new Europe began to take shape, one that would look back on that September day as the instant civilization had stood on a knife's edge and survived. But this wasn't the first or the last time Europe teetered on the brink. But this wasn't the first or the last time Europe teetered on the brink. Every era leaves its fingerprints on the next, and the Siege of Vienna was not born from nothing. Its story was the echo of older empires, of cities that fell and kingdoms that refused to die. To understand how Vienna was saved, we must travel backward, through the ashes of Constantinople, across the bloodied waters of Lepanto, beneath the forgotten stones of Vienna's own buried defenses, and into the haunting legacy of the Polish cavalry whose wings still whisper through history. It begins, as so many European crossroads do, with Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Roman world. In 1453, more than 2 centuries before the guns thundered outside Vienna, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, a boy of barely 21, had stood before the colossal Theodosian walls. Behind those walls, a remnant of Rome clung to existence. The siege of Constantinople lasted just 53 days, but it changed the trajectory of the world. Eyewitness Niccolò Barbaro, a Venetian surgeon inside the city, wrote that the sky glowed red as if heaven itself were bleeding. The final assault came at dawn on May 29th, when Ottoman cannon, massive bronze monsters cast by Hungarian engineer Urban, smashed through stone that had stood for 1,000 years. When the city fell, Europe felt its own heart stop. What's remarkable, though, is how the memory of that fall haunted Vienna in 1683. Ottoman field records recovered from the Vienna siege trenches bear the insignia of Mehmed's dynasty, as if to proclaim, "What began at Constantinople will end here." Modern archaeologists studying the Theodosian walls have uncovered engineering parallels to the siege works used in Vienna, identical tunnel bracing patterns, nearly the same powder chamber design. These findings, published by the Istanbul Archaeological Museum in 2019, reveal that the engineers who surrounded Vienna were not improvising. They were refining techniques born in 1453. Siege warfare, perfected over generations, had come full circle, and yet, in that same span of history, another great echo had sounded, over water, not land. A century after Constantinople's fall, Europe's navies met the Ottoman fleet in a confrontation that would shape the imagination of Christendom. Lepanto, 1571. The largest naval battle in history at the time fought off the coast of western Greece. More than 400 ships locked in combat across a blood-red sea. The Holy League, a desperate alliance of Spanish, Venetian and Papal forces, faced an Ottoman armada that had ruled the Mediterranean unchallenged for 100 years. The battle lasted 5 hours. The sea turned to iron and fire. In the end, the Christian fleet triumphed, but at a terrible cost. 30,000 men perished. The painter Titian would later immortalize the victory in sweeping canvases of divine deliverance. But beneath the artistry lies brutal reality. It was not faith that won Lepanto, but gunpowder, discipline, and the birth of coordinated naval tactics. Centuries later, archivists in Venice uncovered a set of forgotten naval maps from the battle, hand-inked in 1572, showing the wind direction, tide shifts, and ship formations drawn by commanders on the day itself. These relics, studied by maritime historian Andrea di Robilant, showed something profound. The same principles of combined force and alliance that defined Lepanto resurfaced at Vienna. Fragmented powers, when united, could hold back empires. The victory at sea foreshadowed the salvation on land. But history's echoes are not confined to paper and parchment. They lie buried beneath our feet, beneath modern Vienna's cobblestones. Archaeologists have uncovered an entire hidden world. The ghost of 1683 still breathing in the soil. Using LiDAR scans and ground-penetrating radar, researchers from the University of Vienna have mapped a labyrinth of collapsed tunnels stretching under the old city. The remains of both Ottoman mines and Viennese countermines. The discovery, announced in 2020, revealed something astonishing. Entire sections of the subterranean network had caved in and fossilized, preserving wooden beams and tools nearly intact. One chamber even contained a rusted Ottoman pickaxe, still lodged in the tunnel wall, as if the miner had vanished mid-swing. Standing in those tunnels today, you can feel the war beneath your boots. The temperature drops, the air thickens, it smells of earth and iron and of the human fear that once filled it. It is here that historians now believe the siege's true turning point occurred, not in the grand cavalry charge, but in the unseen struggle underground, where each explosion could have erased the city in a heartbeat. Modern excavation teams have even found remnants of 17th century candles, their wax fused into the clay, carbon dated to the very week of the final assault. It is, quite literally, the smell of history preserved. And then there are the walls themselves, Vienna's ancient fortifications. For centuries, they were thought to have been mostly destroyed in later urban renovations. But recent urban archaeology has unearthed fragments of bastions beneath the city's subway system, perfectly aligned with Starhemberg's defensive plans. Engineers using 3D modeling have reconstructed how the defenders adapted medieval walls for modern artillery, adding sloped earthworks and secret gun embrasures. It's a striking reminder that the siege was not a simple clash of armies, but a clash of technologies. One side brought the might of Ottoman siegecraft, the other, the ingenuity of a cornered civilization. Yet perhaps the most enduring echo of all gallops on the wind, the legend of the Polish Winged Hussars. Even centuries later, their charge at Vienna remains the stuff of myth. But what was myth and what was metal? In a warehouse outside Krakow, historians and engineers from the Polish Academy of Sciences have spent years reconstructing original hussar armor from recovered fragments. Breastplates, sabers, and the famed wings themselves. One artifact, a curved saber found near the battlefield of Kahlenberg, bore notches consistent with cutting through chainmail. Another discovery, fragments of the leather harness used to attach the wings, suggest they were far more than ornamental. Tests in wind tunnels at Warsaw Polytechnic proved that the wooden feathers, set at precise angles, generated a low whistling sound when riders reached full gallop. Imagine it. 18,000 horsemen thundering downhill, the air screaming with that unearthly noise. To the Ottoman infantry, it must have sounded like the sky itself descending. But there's another layer, symbolic, almost spiritual. The hussars were more than warriors. They were the embodiment of a nation's resilience. Their armor gleamed with religious inscriptions. Their lances carried small crucifixes bound to the shaft. One recovered lance tip, displayed in the Czartoryski Museum, bears an engraving in Latin, Pro fide et patria, for faith and fatherland. It's easy to romanticize such moments, but these were men who rode through cannon fire, who saw comrades vanish in smoke, and who still pressed forward. In that instant, history and myth fused into something immortal. Modern Poland treats the Hussar legacy as sacred heritage, but historians are careful to separate legend from evidence. A 2022 study by the Jagiellonian University's Department of Military History analyzed over 200 recovered items from the Vienna battlefield, including horseshoes, arrowheads, and sabers, revealing that the Hussars' weapons were technologically superior to most contemporary European cavalry. Their curved sabers, lighter than broadswords but sharper, allowed faster strikes. Their armor, forged in Krakow and Lvov, balanced protection and agility, the product of metallurgy that rivaled any foundry in the West. Fact, not folklore, explains why that charge succeeded. Across Europe, museums still preserve fragments of that day. In Krakow's Wawel Castle, the tent of Kara Mustafa gleams under soft light. Its intricate silk embroidery portraying verses from the Quran, its floor still faintly scented with the spices once stored inside. In Vienna's Heeresgeschichtliches Museum, you can stand before Starhemberg's battered cuirass, dented by Ottoman shot. To walk among these relics is to feel time collapse, to realize that history is not distant, but tactile, tangible. Each artifact, whether a map, a saber, or a torn banner, whispers the same truth. Civilizations rise and fall, not just through conquest, but through memory. And so, the echoes of empires reverberate. The fall of Constantinople warned of collapse. Lepanto showed the power of unity. Vienna proved that even on the brink of annihilation, humanity can endure through courage and cooperation. These were not isolated events, but chapters in one immense unfinished story, the struggle between expansion and resistance, belief and survival, empire and identity. Each generation inherits its own version of that struggle. The archaeologists and historians who piece together these stories are, in a sense, the new defenders of civilization's memory. In the archives of Istanbul, Vienna, and Krakow, their hands tremble over parchment that still smells of candle smoke. They use lasers and drones, carbon dating and digital imaging, modern tools illuminating ancient truths. And with every discovery, the past becomes sharper, the myths more human. Imagine walking through those museum halls today, the soft hum of dehumidifiers, the faint reflection of your face in glass cases that contain objects older than your country. A Turkish scimitar beside a Polish saber, a bullet fused into a crucifix. You realize the battle never truly ended. It just changed shape. The struggle for meaning, for identity, for the story of who we are, that continues in every excavation, every analysis, every question that refuses to fade. Each of these discoveries doesn't just retell history, they rebuild it. They remind us that the clash of civilizations is not merely a tale of war, but of exchange, adaptation, and endurance. The Ottomans left behind art and architecture that shaped Europe's skyline. Europe, in turn, absorbed the East's science, language, and philosophy. Beneath the clash of swords lay a deeper, quieter dialogue, one that continues even now, in the artifacts and echoes we uncover. And so, from the fallen walls of Constantinople to the windswept slopes of Karlenberg, the story of Vienna is not only about a single battle. It is about the persistence of the human will, to build, to defend, to remember. History, it seems, always leaves a trail of echoes, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them. But to understand how those echoes reshaped the world itself, we must step beyond the smoke and steel into the age that followed, when the balance of power shifted and empires began to crumble. The smoke had barely cleared over Vienna when the world itself began to change. What happened on that September morning in 1683 was not just a victory. It was a pivot, a hinge upon which the future turned. The Siege of Vienna ended not only a battle but an era. For more than 2 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had advanced inexorably across the map of Europe, its banners rising over once proud kingdoms, its armies thundering to the gates of Christendom. But after Vienna, the tide that had swept across the continent began to ebb, slow and uncertain at first, then irreversible. The aftermath was strange, almost surreal. The defenders who had clung to life inside Vienna's shattered walls stumbled into sunlight, their eyes hollow, their bodies emaciated. Yet they were witnesses to the moment Europe stopped retreating. Chroniclers recorded the mood as one of awe rather than triumph. "We have seen death," wrote one Viennese monk, "and in surviving we have become strangers to it." In Istanbul, the shock was profound. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa's execution, his silk cord drawn tight under orders of the Sultan, symbolized more than punishment. It was a reckoning. The dream of a swift conquest of Europe died with him. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was now forced to look inward, its energy turning from conquest to preservation. The vast machine of Ottoman expansion began to rust from within. Its provinces restive, its armies cautious, its enemies emboldened. Meanwhile, the victors found themselves in a transformed world. The Holy Roman Empire, long paralyzed by infighting and religious division, rediscovered a fragile sense of unity. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, often dismissed as peripheral, basked in the glory of King John III Sobieski's triumph. For a brief, dazzling moment, Poland stood at the heart of Europe, its king hailed as the savior of the West. Letters of gratitude flowed from Rome, Paris, and even distant London. The Pope ordered a Te Deum sung in every cathedral, proclaiming that divine providence had delivered Vienna. Yet history, as ever, is more complicated than faith. Sobieski's triumph did not save his kingdom from the slow erosion that followed. Within a century, Poland itself would be partitioned, its savior's legacy reduced to legend. Still, the psychological shift was immense. Vienna's survival became the foundation of a new European confidence, a belief that empires could be resisted, that destiny was not fixed. This new stability gave rise to something unexpected, a flowering of science, reason, and inquiry. Historians like John Stoy have noted that the decades following 1683 saw the intellectual ferment that would later be called the Enlightenment. Trade reopened, cities rebuilt, scholars and merchants moved freely again. The threat that had kept Europe in a defensive crouch for generations receded, and in that space of relief, minds expanded. It is no coincidence that Newton's Principia Mathematica was published the same year Vienna was saved. While cannon thundered outside the city's walls, a quiet revolution in thought was unfolding in Cambridge. The human mind, once shackled by fear of the unknown, began to imagine a world governed not by fate, but by laws, laws that could be measured, tested, understood. Perhaps that was the true victory of Vienna, not merely the preservation of territory, but the survival of curiosity. The power balance across the continent began to realign. Austria rose as a dominant Central European force, expanding southward into former Ottoman lands. The Balkans, long the frontier between two civilizations, became a mosaic of shifting loyalties and fragile coexistence. The Habsburg dynasty, rejuvenated by its survival, entered its golden age. Baroque Vienna emerged from the ashes, its architecture a defiant celebration of endurance. The grand domes and gilded facades we see today built over foundations once scarred by cannon fire. But every victory carries its shadows. The triumph at Vienna also fed a dangerous narrative, the idea of a civilizational war between East and West, a story that would echo for centuries in the rhetoric of empire and religion. The battle became mythologized as the moment Christendom triumphed over the Orient, simplifying what had been a complex struggle of politics, culture, and human survival. Paintings and sermons of the era depicted Sobieski as a new crusader. His charge down Kahlenberg Hill transformed into divine intervention. The Polish hussars became angels in armor. The Ottomans, demons in silk. It was a convenient myth, one that soothed Europe's conscience but obscured the shared humanity of both sides. Yet even in myth, meaning endures. Vienna's salvation reshaped global geopolitics in ways few could foresee. The Ottoman retreat opened new trade routes through the Danube, linking Western Europe to the markets of the Black Sea. Merchants from Venice to London profited. Diplomatic embassies blossomed between once bitter enemies. Istanbul, bruised but unbroken, remained a cosmopolitan hub, its scholars and artisans still influencing European thought. The exchange of knowledge, technologies, and art flowed both ways. Proof that even conflict can create bridges in its aftermath. In many ways, the Battle of Vienna marked the dawn of the modern world. It was the last great clash of medieval empires and the first step toward an age of nations and reason. Empires that had once defined themselves by conquest began to define themselves by innovation. Armies gave way to economies. Swords yielded to ideas. The Enlightenment, colonial expansion, and the eventual Industrial Revolution all trace faint lines back to that September day when Europe refused to fall. Even now, historians debate what Vienna truly meant. Was it divine deliverance, geopolitical luck, or simply the triumph of logistics over ambition? Each generation finds its own answer. But what is certain is this: after 1683, the map of the world and the story humanity told itself was never the same. And yet, as with every turning point, the outcome raises a haunting question. What if the tide had not turned? What if the mines beneath the walls had detonated, or the Polish cavalry had arrived a day too late? What if Vienna had fallen, and with it, the fragile order of the West? Because history is not destiny, it is decision. And sometimes a single dawn, a single charge, a single heartbeat of courage decides the fate of civilizations. History often tempts us with the roads not taken, the fragile what-ifs that hang like ghosts above every victory. And none looms larger than this: what if Vienna had fallen? Imagine it, the September morning of 1683, but the Polish cavalry never arrives. The city's last bastion collapses beneath the Ottoman mines. Smoke billows over the Danube as Kara Mustafa's banners rise atop the cathedral spire. Within hours, the gates of Christendom swing open, and the road to Europe lies bare. From Vienna to Venice, from Prague to Paris, a new empire unfolds westward, rewriting the map before the century is out. The Renaissance flickers out. The Enlightenment, never born, remains an unlit candle in the minds of dreamers. It sounds dramatic, even impossible, but scholars remind us how close it truly was. Diaries recovered from the siege's final week show the defenders were down to a single day's powder and food. One surviving Ottoman field map, rediscovered in 2015, marks a tunnel that reached within 40 meters of the city's heart. 40 meters, the distance of a musket shot. Had that mine detonated, Vienna would have ceased to exist. Europe was a coin tossed in the air, writes historian Andrew Wheatcroft, and it landed narrowly on the side of survival. So what would have followed? Would Paris have fallen next? Rome, perhaps? The seat of the papacy transformed into a new imperial jewel? Or London, far across the Channel, trembling under the shadow of a rising Eastern power? Counterfactual historians disagree. Some, like Dr. Caroline Finkel of Istanbul University, argue the Ottoman Empire's logistical limits made such a conquest improbable. The Sultan's armies, she notes, were built for campaign, not occupation. Others, like revisionist scholar Tomasz Lęczewski, believe a victory at Vienna could have fractured Europe's political heart, accelerating its decline by centuries. And then there are the quieter mysteries, the ones that still haunt the soil around Vienna. Rumors of lost Ottoman gold buried during the retreat persist even today. Treasure hunters have scoured the forests beyond Kahlenberg, guided by 18th century maps that hint at caravans that never reach the border. Museum curators whisper of missing banners from Sobieski's victory parade, priceless relics said to have vanished into imperial vaults, never seen again. Perhaps they were stolen, or perhaps they were hidden, awaiting rediscovery. Even the landscape carries its secrets. Satellite archaeology has identified faint patterns in the fields outside the city, geometric traces of earthworks and encampments that match none recorded in known maps. Are they the remnants of a second Ottoman line, or something older, erased by time and myth alike? Technology may yet answer questions that have slept for 300 years. But perhaps the most haunting question of all isn't about gold or banners. It's about fate. Was Vienna's survival a miracle of strategy or something deeper? Sobieski himself believed the charge was guided by providence. His words echo through the centuries. God was with us on the hill. Yet modern historians counter that the outcome hinged on terrain, timing, and human will, not divine hand. So, was it faith or fortune that decided Europe's future that morning? And what truly did Europe learn from it? Did victory breed wisdom, or only more wars born of triumph's arrogance? The questions linger, unanswered like cannon smoke drifting over the centuries. History, after all, is not a monument. It's a mirror. The Siege of Vienna reflects both the best and worst of humanity. Courage and cruelty, unity and division, belief and doubt. It reminds us how fragile civilization really is, how quickly it can burn, and how fiercely it can endure. So as we walk today through the quiet streets of Vienna, beneath the same sky that once glowed with fire, we might pause and wonder, what if the city had fallen? What world would we live in now? And perhaps, somewhere between the ringing of old church bells and the whisper of wind on Kahlenberg Hill, the past still answers, softly, almost imperceptibly, "You were lucky this time."